The Axis counterattacks at El Alamein came from an army under pressure, but not from an army already beaten. As Montgomery's Eighth Army pushed into the defensive system and began the grinding phase of crumbling, Rommel and his commanders had to decide where to strike back, where to hold, and where to spend their shrinking reserves. The German and Italian defense still possessed experienced troops, concealed anti-tank guns, armored formations, and the ability to punish mistakes. Every British gain could become costly if it drew armor into a killing zone or left infantry exposed beyond support. The Axis counterblow matters because it shows that El Alamein did not become inevitable once the British offensive began. The Eighth Army had the advantage, but it still had to survive the enemy's attempt to restore the battle.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
Rommel returned to a front already in crisis. The opening British assault had broken into parts of the line, and the Axis commander faced the immediate problem of judging where the true danger lay. The northern sector was under heavy pressure, especially as British and Commonwealth attacks threatened to draw the fight closer to the coast and the vital routes behind the Axis front. Elsewhere, the mine belts and strongpoints were holding unevenly, creating a battlefield full of local emergencies. Rommel could not simply order a grand sweeping maneuver of the kind that had made his earlier reputation. At El Alamein, the sea, the Qatar depression, the minefields, and the fuel shortage all limited his freedom. His counterblows had to be local, costly, and carefully chosen. The Axis armored reserves were dangerous but constrained. German panzer units, including elements of the Afrika Korps, still had skilled crews and commanders able to coordinate tanks with anti-tank guns and artillery. Italian armored formations also remained in the fight, though often with weaker equipment and under severe supply strain. These forces could counterattack British penetrations, threaten infantry who had advanced too far, and create sudden crises in the crowded forward areas. But they could not move as though fuel were unlimited. Every shift of a panzer formation consumed petrol that might be needed later. Every damaged tank was harder to replace. A counterattack that succeeded tactically could still weaken the army strategically if it burned strength the Axis could not recover. The counterblow worked best when it struck at the seams of the British system. If infantry had seized ground, but anti-tank guns had not yet arrived, Axis armor could be deadly. If tanks had moved into narrow lanes and could not deploy, concealed guns could hit them before they could use their numbers. If communications were confused, a local Axis thrust could create the impression of a larger collapse. This was the same pattern the British had suffered earlier in the Desert War, and it had not lost all its danger. Montgomery's army was better prepared than before, but it was still fighting through mines and darkness. The counterattack exploited not British weakness in the abstract, but the inevitable gaps that appear when any large army attacks a defended line. One of the most important lessons of the Axis counterblows was the continuing power of anti-tank defense. The famous German 88mm gun remained feared, but it was only part of a wider system that included smaller anti-tank guns, field guns, mines, and tank fire. These weapons were most effective when British armor was slowed or funneled into predictable approaches. A tank crew might see only flashes, dust, and the sudden shock of a hit. From the defender's perspective, the goal was to create lanes of fire and hold nerve until the target came into range. The result was that even in a battle where the Eighth Army had material superiority, the forward fight could feel painfully balanced. The attackers had more weight, but the defenders often had the first well-placed shot. British anti-tank units answered in kind, and their role deserves equal attention. The Eighth Army had learned that infantry holding forward ground needed immediate protection against armored counterattack. Guns such as the 6-pounder were brought forward wherever possible, sometimes under extremely difficult conditions, and artillery stood ready to break up Axis movement. There were actions around the central battlefield, including the area associated with Kidney Ridge, where British anti-tank gunners and infantry fought off repeated armoured pressure at close and dangerous ranges. The larger point is not the romance of a single duel. It is that the battle became a contest between armoured thrusts and carefully placed defensive fire, on both sides, with each trying to catch the other at a moment of exposure. The Axis counterattacks also showed the importance of timing. A counterblow launched too late might find that the British had already consolidated, dug in, and brought forward guns. A counterblow launched too early might strike before reserves were concentrated and be defeated piecemeal. Rommel's commanders had to make these decisions with incomplete information, damaged communications, and growing Allied air pressure. The Desert Air Force made daylight movement increasingly hazardous, and British artillery could strike forming up areas or routes once they were identified. In earlier desert battles, Axis mobility had often allowed Rommel to create the tempo. At El Alamein, the tempo was increasingly imposed on him. His counterstrokes still hurt, but they no longer reliably reset the battle. For the British, surviving the counterblow required discipline as much as firepower. Tank commanders had to resist being pulled forward into traps. Infantry had to hold ground, even when enemy armor appeared and friendly support seemed uncertain. Artillery observers had to identify threats quickly enough for guns to matter. Engineers and traffic controllers had to keep routes open so reinforcements, ammunition, and medical evacuation could continue. A counterattack does not need to destroy an entire formation to succeed. It can succeed by creating panic, blocking movement, or forcing a withdrawal from newly captured ground. Montgomery's army had to prove that it could absorb shocks without losing the structure of the offensive. The cost fell heavily on the men holding exposed positions. A forward infantry company might spend hours under shell fire, then face tanks emerging through dust, then endure another bombardment after the attack was beaten off. Anti-tank crews knew that firing could reveal their position and invite return fire, but not firing could mean enemy armor reaching the infantry behind them. Tank crews moved forward through marked lanes, knowing that mines lay just beyond the guide tapes and enemy guns watched the exits. These were not clean, armored maneuvers across a broad plain. They were cramped, frightening fights in which machines, men, and obstacles were packed into narrow spaces. The counterblow made the battlefield feel even smaller.
Italian troops in these actions should be treated seriously. Some Italian formations were poorly equipped compared with German units and faced chronic shortages, but they held positions, fought under bombardment, and took heavy losses. Italian artillery and anti-tank elements contributed to the defensive system, while Italian infantry often occupied sectors where British attacks were relentless. Later myths sometimes turned the Desert War into a duel between British and German armies, with Italy reduced to background. That distorts how El Alamein actually worked. Rommel's front was an Axis front, and its strength and weakness both came from that mixed structure. The British offensive had to break German and Italian resistance together, not defeat a legend made only of panzers.
Yet the Axis counterblows could not escape the larger arithmetic of the battle. Every attack used fuel, ammunition, vehicle life, and human energy. Every tank lost or damaged narrowed Rommel's options. Every local success had to be weighed against the fact that the British could bring up more shells, more tanks, and more fresh units than the Axis could. The Eighth Army also had the advantage of fighting from a better supply base, while Rommel's army remained at the end of a strained chain across the Mediterranean and the desert. This did not make Axis resistance less dangerous, it made it less sustainable. The counterblows were sharp, but each sharp blow wore down the hand that delivered it. The counterattack phase is essential to understanding why El Alamein was won by persistence rather than by one simple stroke. The British did not merely advance until the Axis retreated. They advanced, were checked, absorbed counterblows, reorganized, and pressed again. The Axis did not merely sit in trenches waiting to be overwhelmed. They fought back with skill and inflicted real losses. This interaction gave the battle its grinding character. Montgomery's method depended on making the enemy fight a battle of attrition he could not afford, but that method required British and Commonwealth troops to endure the attrition as well. The difference was not that one side suffered and the other did not. The difference was which side could keep functioning under the losses. In the larger story of armored warfare, the Axis counterblow at El Alamein shows the maturity and danger of defensive combined arms. Tanks attacking into a defended system were vulnerable, but tanks used in counterattack could also be vulnerable if the enemy had prepared anti-tank positions and artillery support. Mines, guns, infantry, armor, air power, and communications shaped every move. The battle was no longer a simple contest of maneuver in open desert. It had become a dense, modern fight in which mobility had to be earned and protected. Rommel's counterstrokes reminded the Eighth Army that even a weakened enemy could still exploit disorder. Montgomery's answer was to keep the offensive coherent long enough for Axis coherence to fail.
The Axis counterblows did not throw the Eighth Army back, and that was their most important failure. They hurt the attackers, slowed the timetable, and made every gain costly, but they did not restore the old desert pattern in which Rommel seized the initiative and forced another British retreat. Instead, the counterattacks consumed scarce Axis strength while the British foothold endured. The line was still not broken, but it was being stressed in more places than Rommel could comfortably repair. The battle now moved toward the northern struggle, where Australian attacks would draw more and more Axis attention toward the coast. El Alamein remained undecided, but the direction of pressure was clear. The Axis could still strike back, yet each counterblow made the coming break a little more possible.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.